I'm really grateful that you're willing to sit down and do the interview. I wonder if we could start, if you wouldn't mind giving me your full name and telling me where you're from.
Okay, whenever you get ready.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm William Dub Warrior. I'm from Brackettville, Texas, where I was born and raised until I got married and went into service. And I'm now living in Delray. I've been in Delray for the last 55 years, I believe. And I came up to participate in this conference. And I'm glad to be interviewed by Paul.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ward, can you tell me, when you were growing up, how much of the history of your family's ancestry did you learn growing up, and who taught it to you, or how did you learn it?
My grandmother raised me, and I went to live with my grandmother when I was 4, I think. So she raised me and my older brother and sister. Mm-hmm. And I was the one she kept around all the time. When she would go visit the old folks, which there wasn't no cars, you know. And I'm talking about in 34, 35. So the way the old people did, they had the same ways that they left from here, they were still practicing them. They would cook a little something and make sure that the neighbor or one of the cousins or somebody had some too. They would take little dishes. Hey, I fixed this. I think like they were having a contest in cooking cuisine and see who cooked the best. That's what I'm thinking now since I've gotten older. I said, why because it wasn't enough for the family, but it was a taste. And this is what people need to get back now, because there's so many people that are one in a house or 2 old people. Mm-hmm. And I think they need to do that more, but people don't have time to visit or nothing. I know I have children and grandchildren, and their mother and their sisters live in the same area or in the same town. Mm-hmm. But they're like, Fort Worth is a big town, you know. Right. It's a city. And they go for weeks and don't even call each other on the phone. I don't understand that, you know. It's just, I got my job, I got my life to live. Mm-hmm. Whenever I get time, I'll call you or something. But I have friends that I see almost every day. If I don't see them, they call. Mm-hmm. You know, it doesn't take, and they're on the phone. Mm-hmm. That's what I tell my daughter. I said, you should call us every day. I said, you on the phone? She said, well, she works at a university. And she says, I talk to people so much. I don't. I said, well, just call and say, hey, how are you guys? I'm all right. You know, that's it. Yes, I said, we don't need a conversation. We just need that contact to know, well, I heard from her today. And we do have some people in our group that do call every day.
Mr. Warrior, was that the way things were in your community when you were growing up? People had more contact with each other?
Oh, yes. Yes, if they didn't, they'd send the kids over. Mm-hmm. Go over and see how Aunt Molly is doing. See if you can do anything for her. Mm-hmm. And see if she's sick. And when they were sick, they'd send the kids back and forth with things. And my Aunt Molly Perman, I used to, as a kid, I'd get upset because she would leave her house, walk over to my grandmother's house, and she would have me go to the store for her, you know? Mm-hmm. And I couldn't understand it. I said, she's got grandkids down there. Why don't she send them to the store? But I couldn't voice it though, because you get that slap upside the head, you know. You didn't talk about old folks, you know. And I used to like it when at night in the summertime, they would visit each other, you know. And they would, when they came in, you went out. So I had liked that, because whenever she had a visitor, I was glad, because then I had a chance to go out and play with the other kids, you know. And
it was kind of like that, oh, you were to be seen but not heard.
That's right. Mm-hmm. But my grandmother, I was the baby in the family, so she kept me around, so I heard a lot of things. And she would sit down and tell me. Mm-hmm. She told me one time, she said, you know, you kids are going to go to school. This was during the Depression. And I had a speech, I had a contest, must have been 9, I guess, maybe 10. And she was so prolific in her languages. And you know what? How she pronounced words? She would conjugate them. And she had only gone to the 2nd grade, but you think she had a college education. She could write fluently, could read books and everything. And she came up, she was born in 1875. And she was one of the smart old ladies. She learned medicines. You know, to use herbs. And I remember now they had chicken grease. And I don't think they do that anymore. They would get the fat out of the chicken, you know, and they put it aside, and they would render it. And then they would put it in jars and keep it for the winter. And they would rub the kids' chest. You have colds. They used to have, I don't guess you're old enough to see anybody do that. They had the croup. They call it the croup.
I've heard of that. But
and it would sound like you're barking the kids when they cough, you know. And so they would rub your chest with that, warm it first, and then put it all over your chest, boy or girl. And then they would have, now, the flannel. Boy, if you had a piece of red flannel, it had to be red. I don't know why it had to be red, but they had that red flannel, and they put it over there, and the kid probably was just stopped up with cold, and by the next morning, when they wake up, it's all gone. And then they had different roots and stuff that they would use for different things. They even used the cow, the cow too, but the pig, the little cover on their feet. You know, they would boil the foot, and that thing come off, you know, pig feet. And they would save those. And they would dry out, and then they would make some kind of a tea out of it for certain things, for women or something. I don't know which one it was. But they lived off the land, you know. And I don't know if you know what nopalitos are.
No, sir.
You know cactus?
Right.
The ones with all the thorns with the big leaves.
Okay.
They call that nopalitos. And they have... here a while back, they had a joke on the nopalitos. They said that what the Mexicans use for sex control, well, it's not sex control, but birth control, was nopalitos.
Okay.
Now, you know what that means, no sex.
Right. Yeah.
In Spanish, nopalitos, no hit.
Yeah.
See?
I was wondering, yeah.
You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Nopalitos.
But I never heard of the cactus.
You know what they use? They don't use, that guy said, they don't use any birth control. They use nopalitos. Nopalitos. And then finally I got it. You know?
That's funny.
But no, we came along with things like that. I didn't learn to speak Spanish now. The neighborhood I was in, we had a mixed neighborhood. And there were some Mexican kids that I played with. But at this particular time, nobody mentions it. But these kids, it was just, they hadn't been into the American schools too long, you know. So they made them speak English. And see, I lived in, like I said, there's two kind of poors, you know. One is po, and the other one is poor. Well, see, the poor people don't know they're poor. You know, but the pole shows it. You know, they got no clothes, they barefooted, they don't have nothing to eat, you know, and they make soup and all of them drink the soup or something. Now that's pole. We didn't have too many pole people because the rabbits sustained us in you know, meat during the 30s, you know, and varmints, fish. So we always had, why not had no bread? But we had some sort of fowl or varmint or either goats or something. I remember you could buy a whole goat for about $2. You know what a goat costs you now? About $90.
Right.
I'm serious.
That's amazing.
And so these things sustained us when I was coming up.
Mr. Warrior, it sounds like your grandmother was a person who really told a lot of wisdom, and she knew a lot of.
Did.
Do you remember any stories that she told in particular that kind of stick with you?
Yeah, you know, she told me a story about my uncle, her husband's uncle, when I was a kid, and that story is a big deal right now. See, we have some Indian scouts. There was the Seminoles, you know, they brought them over from Mexico in 1870 to scout for the U.S. Army. And she told me a story about my uncle, John Warrior Ward. And she said, you know, he stammered real bad, and he could not say his full name. So what they did when he went to enlist in the Scouts, I don't know, it must have been his first enlistment. I think he enlisted when he was 16 or something. And they asked him his name, and he could not say John Warrior. He would say John War. They asked him again, and John War. So the guy that was enlisting him, I don't know whether he was a non-commissioned officer or a commissioned officer, but he just put down John Ward. And this was in about 1871 or 2. And that name still goes for his offsprings. And his name is John Ward now by the Army, and he got the Medal of Honor from Lieutenant Bullis in 1875. So his name is John Ward, but he was a warrior. And my great-grandfather's brother, and he had the same name that I have, William Warrior. And so I told the Wards now, and they said, oh no, our name is Ward. I said, well, now I'm saying, can you explain this? Your grandfather, his dad's name was Tony Warrior. Now that's his legal daddy, I said. Now, how did he get the Ward? Well, he's the Ward. So right now we have that argument about it. Well, my other grandfather, my grandmother didn't tell me we were warriors, you know. And I said, well, there's the history, and it tells it in history. They still don't like it. They don't like it to these days.
That's interesting. Mr. Warrior, did other stories about those years in the 1870s, were they passed down to you as a young man?
Yes, and I know some of the people. See, I got to know quite a few of the scouts, maybe 10 or 12 scouts, because the last one didn't die until my Uncle Curtis Jefferson. He didn't die until 1969. 1969, yeah, 69. And so I got to know quite a few of them and talk to some of them. And I would listen to them tell tales and stuff. In fact, I used to during the summer work on ranches because I had to go to school. But the other boys my age, they were working already. They started working on ranches because their fathers were working on ranches. And so they came out of school when they were 15, 16 and went to the ranches. So I would work on this in the summer only. I could go, and competition was great. These guys worked on the ranch all the time. So here I am in school. I had to go out and compete with them. So we came up very competitive. So the Seminoles, they didn't do it with animosity sometimes, but if you could do something and I try to do it, and I can't do it, you can't make fun of me because I can't do it like you. I would do it over and over when I got a chance until I could be as good as you were. So they speak about the Indian Scouts, how good they were.
Yes, sir.
And I tell anybody, I said, you know why they were so good? They were competitive. Whatever you could do, I'm going to learn to do it. If it took me 3 or 4 months, I can't do it as good as you, but I'm going to be able to do it sufficiently, you know. So this is the way we came up. Not today. it's not that
It's,
way
it's
today.
different now.
It's
Well,
completely different.
Mr. Warr, I wonder if I could ask you, I have to ask you this question because, I've seen this movie, and it's a very interesting movie, but I know that it's not, there's a lot of problems with it, historically speaking, and that's the Danny Glover film, Buffalo Soldiers. How does that film contrast with what you heard growing up? I mean, what are some of the problems with that film?
Well, they had the wrong, well, I don't say characters in the movie, but the story was bad.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't true. And then a lot of things they did, but it didn't happen. I tell you what, I saw that movie, and it was, the uniforms and everything, but the contrast was beautiful. And the dialogue was good. Everything, the uniforms were nice and everything. I've been in pictures before, and I've been around John Wayne and then worked with them in the movies. But the story was wrong. It makes the thing real bad. It was untrue. It didn't say it was fiction. It said the Buffalo Soldier, And they had my grandfather, John Horse, as a scout, and he never was a scout. Now, my grandfather, his son, Joe Coon, was a scout. You'll see him listed in the book. I have one of the books up there in the room. And but John Horse never did, and was a scout. And he didn't come over as a scout. When he came over, John Kibitz brought him over in 1817, and he became a scout. He was an old man, and he lived about 4 years after the scouts were formed, and he's buried in our cemetery. And they called him, his Indian name was Sititastanuche. They say that was, he was a chief. They called him a chief. And I've got, just recently I've come to the concern, how come they had so many chiefs? But you know what? I had the men that was in charge of a bunch of cowboys or something, the guys called them chiefs. So I've come to the concern, anybody that was in charge, like a mayor or somebody, they called them chiefs, And that's where that came from. Like Osceola, he was not a chief. He was in charge of a bunch of the Seminoles group, but he was never a registered chief in the group there. And my grandfather, Juan Caballo, he was a chief, but they had him. The reason why they made him a chief is because he was over the black Seminoles, a group of them, and he was a warrior, so they made him a war chief. So I've come to the conclusion, I never have discussed this with any of the historians or anybody, but I figured out that anyone that that was in charge of a group, that were the chiefs. Okay, now you have the word civilians use the word captains or caporal. Now the Mexican used the word caporal, like the guy that's over the cowboys. Yeah. He's a cowboy too, and he's not the boss because he doesn't own it, but they make him in charge. The foreman. That's what that means. So this is my conclusion to the fact, but I don't know if it's right or not. But I do know my people used to call whoever was in charge of a project or something the men. They would call him the chief.
Okay.
So I think that's how that word is used in our group.
Mr. Warrior, how would you define, when people say black Seminole, and in Florida, students will say, well, what does that mean? How do you define it?
I'm glad you asked that question. I was president for many, many years of our Seminole group, Seminole Scouts. Now, they used to use the colored troops. That's what they used to use. And now, it says black Seminoles. This is to depict who we are. We are Seminoles. Now, I understand that other black Indians don't use the word black, but this is to say, oh, he's a Seminole, but you haven't seen me. Then when you see me, I'm black. Say, thought Seminoles are Indians.
Right.
you know? So I have my group down there. Some of them, the president of the group now, he doesn't like to use that word. And I said, well,
The word black.
the black.
Okay.
He doesn't like to use the word black. And I told him, I said, whenever I write or say something, or maybe on a video or something like an interview like this, I use the word black so you can see. That doesn't make me any less Seminole, because we were adopted into the Seminole Nation. See, so this is the way my band is named. We formed a coalition of the 5 civilized tribes, the black units. And that's when I was selected as the chief of the United Warrior Band of the Seminole Nation. And so that is the group that we are called. And my name, the United Warrior Band, that doesn't mean it's about me.
Yeah.
You see, it means that's what the name of the bands, community bands, that's the 5 bands under the same heading. The United Warrior Band is the Chief, the Creeks, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Creeks, and the Seminoles. But that's the group that we are in. And so that, a lot of people might think that, oh, that's my name, that's mine. No, but that's not. I just represent the Seminole group.
Now, Mr. Warrior, when you say adopt in the term adopted, now you're referring to the Florida, the antebellum,
what happened is, see, I have been going to court. It's out of the courts right now, and to the in Washington, and we have a suit in against the U.S. government for our part as being with the Indians, you know, and we were adopted when it came up and they put them on the reservation. We were adopted into, we were with them, so they adopted us. And when you adopt a child of somebody, you have the same rights as anybody else. You don't have that. I adopted a boy, a Hispanic boy, and he was my son all the way till he died, you know. But he had the same rights. If he'd lived, I have the daughter and him. And everything was going to be split, whatever we had between the both of them. So it's not the color, it's the the cohesion that you have. And when you adopt somebody, see, when they asked them about their black allies and family, because some of them were entwined, you know, together, they were actually family, some of them were, and then they were friends. So we went through an adoption period there. So what happened when this money came up here a while back, they wanted to disown the black in Florida, not in Florida, but in Oklahoma. And so I talked to, they had 2 women chiefs in the Seminole, black Seminole unit. And this one lady, she's a sub-chief, and she said that we go to the meetings, we're in all the meetings, but whenever money is going to be discussed, they don't allow us in the meetings. But because they tried to outlaw and said they go by blood, you know. So the group that I was with, suing for interest, was they went by adoption. Adoption means more than by blood, they said, you know, to qualify. So we were adopted by the Seminoles. And the reason why they was suing for part of the money was because the government gave them land, and so the Seminoles, so much land and everything, but the Seminoles said, well, we are too crowded. We adopt them as such, but we need to give them land, their own land. And this had never been done, and the money was saved by the government, and so the government is saying, trying to get out of it, say, well, you got to go back to them, it's their fault, but it's not. The government never did give them the money that they were going to give them for the adoption, say. So that's what I was going to court for.
I see. Mr. Warrior, now, how did your family come to originally be in Texas, and then you said a branch in Mexico? How did they originally, do you know that part of the story?
Yes. You know, it started with the U.S. government as the cause of them being over there. So they went to Oklahoma with the rest of the Indians, Trail of Tears. Mm-hmm. And some of them went by, a lot of them went by boat. And then they got to certain points where they had to walk. And then they were migrating, going to Oklahoma. Well, it was the Indian country at that time, and it was the Badlands. You know, that land was no good. The outlaws used to go into, remember the movies? Because it wasn't no good, and outlaws, if they got hot, they just go in there, you know. And so that's why, and nobody wanted it. It was good. No good, like John Horace said. He went down from here down to check it out when they wanted to move him. And he came back, and he said, that's a bad place. It's no good. It's too hot in the summer, and it's too cold in the winter, mm-hmm. and it was barren. And the ground, you couldn't grow vegetables or anything in it too good. Trees and stuff was kind of barren. And the wind blew all the time. He said it was no good, like Florida. You know, it's moderate, you know, and the weather, it had its setbacks, but it was
right.
not like that, see?
Uh-huh.
So when he came back, he told him, he told the other end, he said, no, it's no good. Abraham, see, John Horace and Abraham fell out about that. Mm-hmm. Abraham came back and told him, yeah, it was good, and take the money and go and everything. And so John Horace, when he went into Mexico, Abraham wouldn't go, you know, because he was kind of, and then they said that Abraham had gotten money, extra money, and good land, see, to get the rest of them to go, you know. They call them bandidos, sellouts, you know. Yeah. And they said that's what he did. So he wasn't going to go to Mexico, but Coahuacachi, Wildcat, and John Horace, they would have made him disappear, maybe. Mm-hmm. Did magic on him. So, but now they went into up there, and the government, they were mad at them. So you know where they put them? With the Creeks. And they were fighting. They were enemies. You know, so this will punish you. Say, for instance, you got a child, and that child's rebellious, and then you're going to send them somewhere. You send them to somebody who's going to whip them and treat them bad, you know. Right. So the Creeks was trying to sell them, the blacks as slaves and stuff. So I don't know whether Wildcat would have gone with John Horace to Mexico if he had become chief. But if he'd have become chief, it would have been different, because he was with John Horace. You know, they were captured, John Horace and them, with Osceola. Mm-hmm. And then they escaped. But they put them down there, and things were bad. So I guess they stayed 2 years, I guess. Then they left and went looking for help and stuff. Then went to Mexico. And Mexico told them, come on over. We did away with slavery. We don't have to worry about that. 20 years we had given up slavery. Mm-hmm. So come in. But they didn't tell them that they were going to have to serve in the army, right, and take care of, you know, and become the outer perimeter guards, you know. Guards and so, but anyhow, that didn't matter to them because they were fighting anyhow. They found out over there. So that's why they went to Mexico. But then Mexico got bad because it got in poverty and everything. They didn't have money and stuff, so at times were tough. Mm-hmm. So they were asked to come to the United States, and they came to Texas at Brackettville and Eagle Pass. So that's where the change come, okay, from Oklahoma to Mexico. After 20 years, they went to Mexico 20 years, and then they came back to the United States on the 4th of July, 1870.
And Mr. Warrior, you can actually trace your family ancestry through that journey, mm-hmm, in essence.
It started here. Mm-hmm. We go back to, I have 10 generations. I go back to And the number one that I go back to is my great-great-grandfather. I can't find him anywhere in the history, but his name was Guerrero. So he was here when on the Spanish, when the Spanish on it. And then my wife's grandfather was here too. July, but they called him Julio. And they didn't have but the one name, see. So that's before the wars, I think.
Before the Seminole Wars, yeah. Growing up, Mr. Warrior, did your family talk about how they had obtained their freedom or slavery times, or not much?
No, all they talk about is when they were fighting the Indians, but they never talked about Africa or none of the other countries. I'd heard my grandmother mention the Bahamas one time, Jamaica, and that's all. But they talked about here all the time.
Okay.
So I don't know where it started, 1600s, I think.
Okay.
But I don't know where the blacks started from, you know. I don't have no record of that.
So did they talk about how, in terms of their freedom and...
They were always free.
They
said
free. Okay.
that they were always free. That's why they fought so hard, because they said, if we don't go back to the slave part, nobody escaped from slavery that they talked about. So they had like 250, 300 years back that seemed like they were free.
That they were free. So they would have, did they fight in the Second Seminole War, or were they already...
Yes, John Horse, you know, he was fighting before, and when they captured him, he was one of the entourage, the one that I guess guards, like, you know, he and Wildcat were young, basically going behind Osceola, and I think it was about 25 or 30 in that entourage that you know, they were women. And it didn't say anything about children, but I'm quite sure it should have been some children involved. And then I used to hear my grandmother and them talk, and they were talking, some of the old ones, and they talked like back then you couldn't hardly understand them because it was Gullah, I guess. And they said, I was a little boy listening, and they said, and you know, John Horse and Wildcat, they escaped from the compound that they had them in. And Osceola was sick, and he had an Indian wife and a black wife. Well, the Indian wife was sick. They had a fever or something, you know. And this black wife was taking care of, you know, medicating them and everything, you know. And they said that this is the way they said it. And you know, John Horse and Wildcat, them been make themselves lily people, and that's how they been escaped. Because and I was a little boy, and I said, that's magic, you know. If you're gonna be a grown person, then you make yourself little to go through a hole. I said, and about that same time, you're probably not old enough, but that's when they first came out, where this movie came out, where this guy took this stuff and the chair was bigger than him.
Oh, right,
know?
yeah.
So I said, how could they do that? You know? And the movie came out about that time, so I was under the impression that that's what happened. And I said, these people could do magic, you know? But what they meant, after I got grown and figured it out, they wouldn't eat, they lost weight to go out through the hole in the camp. You know, they have that hole, it's like a chimney on the wall, and it goes up, and the sunlight comes down there. Well, the sun would shine, and that was the light they had in that dungeon. And so they, at night, would make holes and climb so far until they had it all the way up where they could get out. And it's maybe 20 or 30 foot high. But then there's a moat around the building, you know, that with water in it. And I think now that what they were doing, those things were made out of stucco or something.
Okay.
You know, and it was there to keep it moist so that it won't shift or anything. And they're telling you to do that to your houses during hot summer to keep them from shifting. And so these guys jumped off and they fell in that thing, see. So they didn't get hurt
Wow.
because maybe about 4 or 5 foot of water, and then it fall in there, and that's how they escaped. And then they started with the second Seminole War.
Right. That's incredible. So you just grew up hearing stories, Mr. Warrior, that they
Yeah.
would take you back to the Second Seminole War, the First Seminole War, and that was just a part of growing up. You would
Yeah.
hear the stories that people, elders would
And
tell.
some of those people had lived, I guess, during that time, because we had people that could tell the story, and it was told to them by their elders. And I heard another lady, this book that's out now, the granddaughter's here. Her name is Rafaela Brown. And her mother just wrote a book. She used to go around with me. She'd been to Washington with me to the Folklife Festival. And they used her to talk about Mexico, because she stayed over in Mexico until she was about 18 or 20. Mm-hmm. And she came to the United States. But her grandmother, Rose Fay, was talking to my grandmother one time, and I heard them talking. She talked about her mother telling her about a massacre, that the Indians massacred a bunch of them in a wagon train. Mm. And I was thinking she was saying her, but she was talking about her mother. And this must have been about 1935, and about the Indians during the massacre. And I even remember her saying that 2 Indians rode up to the wagon train. And I couldn't, after I got big enough to study, and I couldn't figure out what period this was, but it was the period when they were traveling from Oklahoma to Mexico. Mm-hmm. I found it out later, and then she documented it, that was her great-grandmother, wow, Rose Kelly, that was telling that story. She was a girl about 8 or 9. I think they said about a teenager today, the lady Shirley Mark was talking about, but she wasn't that old. She wasn't a teenager. She was 9, I think she said, 8 or 9. And she told a story about how they were massacred. They killed a bunch of them in that exodus to Mexico. Mm-hmm. And that's coming out in the history books now and stuff, that they did that. But I couldn't figure out where that was when I first came out with it. Things that were told that I happened to hear, I had to put them together after I got grown. Like my Uncle Joseph Phillips. Now I got to know him. Uncle Joe died in 1935, and 34 or 35. And he was telling my grandmother, which was his niece, about him fighting Indians in Mexico. And the Indians were in the head of them about 3 or 4 days or something like that, and they were trailing them. And I found out it was in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And the Indians would hit a water hole, and then when they got there and they got all the water they want, and these guys were coming behind the animals and the bones, and they would use it as a restroom, but trying to putrefy it so they wouldn't have water. And then they said it was so thirsty. Mexico doesn't have that much water off when you get off of the Gulf there. Right. And it's kind of an arid country in spots. And so he said, I had to take my kerchief, he called it, and put it over my mouth to drink the water because we were so thirsty to keep from sucking up the maggots in it. Yeah. And that's when I answered. I was a young boy sitting there, was all sitting around the fire. Right. And I said, Uncle Joe, I said, you mean to tell me you drank that old dirty water? And he answered me. He said, son, a thirsty man will do anything for a drink. And I found that out with the, in Arizona, those people traveling across that desert, and they would have to save their urine and then drink it. Mm. And so I know it's got to be bad. I'm thankful to never have been that thirsty. But he said they would put rocks in little rocks in their mouth to keep their mouth moist. And I found out that was in Mexico. Years later, that exodus with them was in Mexico. So that's how I got into this. Mm-hmm. Ever since I was little, and they would come around and talk to my grandmother, and I would be giving them water or something. I could hear the conversation. Mm-hmm. And it's just been picking it up like that.
Okay. Did the and can you talk a little bit, Mr. Warrior, about like what relations were like when you were growing up in terms of say race relations in Texas? I mean, how they were. And
Well, see, we didn't travel very much
Uh-huh.
at that point. You know, when I was coming up as a little boy, and I was in a mixed neighborhood, and so myself, we didn't have any problems really. In Brackettville, the Seminoles didn't, because we were segregated against. We didn't go to the movies. We didn't go to school. Other than that, see, the Cowboys, they worked with these guys and became big buddies and stuff, you know. They worked for them. In fact, some of the older guys worked for them so long, they helped raise their kids. They taught them how to ranch and everything. I have right now a guy, he's Bill Cawthon. He was president of one of the big banks there in Delraville. And he was telling me there was a guy that worked for them for years, and he had a son. And the son was almost my age. This boy, as he graduated from high school in '58, I think. Bill graduated from high school, and he had liked this guy because the son, he said he taught him how to ride a horse and everything. This guy's a multimillionaire now. And when we talked, we just sat down and talked. I called him, the kid, I called him Bill, and he called me Willie, you know, or William. And sometime when I see him, we'll talk for a while. And he said he's getting kind of sick now, but when he graduated from college, I think he went to school in Massachusetts. And when he graduated, he didn't go back to the ranch. He went into business with the banks, you know. Then his cousin, they had a ranch, and he graduated from college and he went into the insurance business. This is when the kids stopped following in the footsteps of their fathers, you know, because these boys, I worked on ranches where boys 16 years old would take 10 or 12 cowboys out and work them. He would be the boss, you know, because his dad taught him so well. But the guys, they started not going back to the ranch. Well, Bill went back to the ranch now. He lives on the ranch. But things were pretty good, but Brackettville was always different. I live from Uvalde is on the east side of us, Brackettville. It was very, very prejudiced there. You couldn't walk on the sidewalk or something over there. And then Delraville, where I live now, was prejudiced. And when the blacks from Brackettville go to Delraville, they would have to fight the law. They would fight the law. If you said they're going to kick them or push them around, they said, no, you're going to have to kill me. They've hit them and took the pistols away from them and stuff. I mean, they were fighters, so I've even got in trouble. I didn't really get in trouble, but the sheriff made me walk in the middle of the street at 7 o'clock at night, he said, because they didn't allow the blacks to walk on the sidewalks at night. You had to be out in the street. So it has changed considerably because I belong to the Historical Society. I'm a commissioner. I was a trustee on the Whitehead Museum. We had the museum there for over 20 years. I had to resign to get off that position and give somebody else a chance. So, and I belonged to Beautifying the Commission. I was deputy sheriff, and I was on the draft board for over 10 years, and I've been almost everything there. And but I'm the only one that won't see. If you get into being community work, they will keep you busy, right? Because everybody doesn't like it, you know. So we had no problem there as a people there in Brackettville. I'm not talking about Texas, right? I'm just talking about Brackettville.
Mr. Warrior, in the work that you do, that you've done in the past several decades, and earlier you touched on this in a couple ways. One, you talked about how times started changing, kids no longer followed in their parents' footsteps, and but how do you, with all of this happening, all these changes, how do you maintain an identity as a black Seminole or as a people? I mean, how do you go about doing that in a society which doesn't really value things like history.
Yeah. Well, we've always been known as Seminoles in Brackettville because they came to Brackettville in 1870. And they've always called us Seminoles. We didn't like it because at that time the Indians were looked down as predators, you know. And so they would call us Seminoles. I mean, outside the blacks did, about them, but they didn't call us Seminoles to our face because we would fight them. So we've always been known as Seminoles, the Seminoles from Brackettville in Mexico. So that's how I use the word now. I said, if you notice, when I said we are the black Seminoles from Mexico and Texas, mainly Brackettville. Of course, we're all over the world now, but they asked me how many people do I have in my group. I can't count them. But I guess we have 2,000 to 3,000. And I group all over the world because we have some that we don't even know, descendants, you know.
Yeah.
But we have been Seminoles all my life. And before then, when they left Florida, they were Seminoles. And they are still Seminoles today. And so that's what we've been known as since then. They said to belong to or become a tribe, you have to have been known as such over 26 years and kept up the traditions and stuff. So we go back over a century back, I know for sure. So when we put in for to be recognized by the BIA, I have paperwork that, in fact, my uncle, Curly Jefferson, in 1939, I have a copy of the letter from the BIA that they wrote up there trying to get recognized. And then John Horse, where we have a place in Fort Clark now, and from where our building is in Fort Clark, about 200 yards is where he got ambushed by the Texas outlaw. I can't think of his name right now, but he was pretty tough, and they tried to kill him. In fact, they killed Titus Payne. And then John Horse was wounded. He was wounded twice, and his horse was wounded four times. But the reservation where they stayed was only about a block and a half from where he got ambushed. So he went in there, and I can't remember the year, 1885 or 84, when he was ambushed. He went to the Seminoles, and stayed there and recuperated. And when he got well, he went back to Mexico. He never did come back to the United States. He just disappeared. We have the son, my grandfather, Joe Coon was his name. And when his daddy disappeared on his way to Mexico City to get paperwork on the land that they were on, he disappeared. So when the son went over there, back to maybe a year or two later, to Mexico, they told him about his father disappearing. So he goes looking for him, so he disappeared. So we don't have their graves around. Just like Wildcat, he died in Nacimiento, but it's been so long ago, nobody knows where the grave is. But they're still in our history.
Right. Mr. Warren, what does it mean for you individually and also as a representative of the Black Seminoles to be back in Florida?
Oh gosh, I almost didn't make it. I was sick and everything, and my wife said, "You can't go anywhere." I said, if I don't go this time, I probably won't make it no other time. So I took medication and talked to my doctors, my Army doctors, and they said, well, if you feel good enough, we give you some more medication. So I said, if I have to go by myself, I don't know if I'm going to go. So they got my daughter to come with me. She's a nurse, and she got off from her job to come with me. But I've always wanted to see. I was in touch with John Griffin here, and he wanted me to come up and go to the Dade Massacre. See, I'd read about the Dade Massacre and everything, and so I knew that this old scout that we have buried there, we're talking about him, Dembo Factor, and they were talking about him being at Fort Mose, and then he was in the Dade Massacre, see, and so I said, well, we have 2-3 more scouts that's buried in our cemetery, and I wanted to bring some of the dirt off their graves up here to John or to the Underground Railroad or whatever, and with the name on it, his name on it, that he was buried in our cemetery, and then bring the dirt back as a ritual and give it to them here, like you send the ashes for somebody. And so John told me tonight, just a while ago, I'll send you some pouches to put it in.
Wow.
I said I was trying to think of it. But these guys were here, and he fought in the Seminole Wars. And then we have some that fought in the Civil War. See, these guys were stayed in the Army, and they were all in Texas area and stuff like 24th, 25th Infantry, 9th and 10th Cavalry. And so they came along and married some of the Seminole women, see. So that's how we entwined with, see, we weren't emancipated, the Seminoles from here. We weren't emancipated. We went into Mexico in 1850, before the Civil War, didn't come out until 1870. So we never was emancipated. So and then I can't trace back to where we were slaves. However, it was probably that some of the people did use the Underground Railroad, but my particular bunch didn't. You know, they went to the Trail of Tears, then they went to Mexico. They fought their way all the way into Mexico. Then we came back, you know, so we never did. But there are units, I'm quite sure. Do you know, before 1850, there were blacks in Mexico. They were in Mexico.
Right.
But I guess some of them had been slaves. So later years, there were 3 sets of people there. There were Mexicans, and then Seminoles, and then blacks, other blacks. Now, I don't know whether they came off of islands or what, but there was a group of them there. Of course, during the time, they just mixed the Mexicans, the blacks, and the Seminole mixed. So we have the mixture there. So, but I don't know where the ones where they came from before 1850. So we are all mixed up there. So I don't know where or when. Mexico doesn't know where they come from. So we are a mixed bunch of people. So they're a rainbow of colors.
Exactly. Mr. Warrior, we just had the 5-minute alert about coming to the end of the interview. Are there other thoughts or that you'd like to share before we kind of wrap it up that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
Yes, you know, I saw the picture on the screen of the Seminole Scouts, and we had the first one was the grandfather of the Paynes that are here. That was their grandfather. And Plenty Payne was his name. Now, I really don't think that was his name, but they called him Plenty. And well, close, coming from this area and the African diaspora, that probably is Plenty. You know, I guess he had plenty or something. Somebody had plenty. So anyhow, that's his name. I always contest that. I don't know. But anyhow, the first guy standing there is Plenty Payne. The next guy is Billy July, which is my wife's grandfather. So my daughter's here, that's her grandfather, see? And all these guys right here. So I asked Genevieve, I said, well, what happened to your grandfather, Plenty Payne? And she said, you know, she said, he stole a saddle or something. And they put him in jail, sent him to the penitentiary. The family never saw him anymore. And that's the guy that #1 scout there.
Wow.
And I have an uncle that got lost too. He was a scout, but after the scouts were over in 1914, he disappeared. Nobody has heard from him no more.
Huh.
And then we had another guy. I did a program in Washington 2 years ago. They found his body at St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C. And my friend, Zadora Campbell, it's on the internet. Zadora Campbell got in touch with me, and we got to talking, and I'm the only one that knew of this guy that was living because his family had all died. And I knew he was missing because I asked his niece one day. She was married to my wife's uncle, and I asked her and lied. I said, "Who was the guy that was named William Shields?" And she said, "Oh, son, that was my daddy's brother, William." Said he got lost since 1914. But the records show later this guy goes into the archives up there in Washington, find out that how he got there, because where he was buried, they had no paperwork on him. I talked to the doctors, the people that were in charge of the hospital. They said, "We don't know." But then we found out from the archives that we don't know how he got there, but he got sick, and they sent him there, I guess, because they had to have sent him there in 1909, because he died in a year's time. He died, and so they buried him there. But the reason why this guy going through the cemetery looking for his grandmother's grave, he was a historian. He saw the grave there, and it says, William Shields, Seminole Wars. This guy's a historian. He said, "That's wrong." Said, so he got to find out that he was a scout, and I told him, "Yeah, William Shields." And so he went into the archives for 2 or 3 days, and he found 5 different scout discharges on him. And so that was a hospital for mental patients. So I guess he had a mental problem because he got sick. And they said that Colonel McKenzie had been there at one time. You ever heard of Colonel McKenzie? McKenzie's Raiders?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know, he was a big shot. He was a general during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And he was down on the border. In fact, he and the scouts raided into Mexico and got 50 prisoners and brought them back. The way it says that it was not a complete order really, but some general, I can't remember his name, told him, "You go in there, these guys coming over here raiding and kidnapping women and everything." Said that the Apaches and the Kickapoos, they were Comancheros. So he sent this group in there. He said, "Now, if you guys get caught over there or something, it was not no order. You did it on your own." And so they went in there and they captured about 50 prisoners and brought them back. And one of the scouts, they had to tie her. She was an she was a princess because her daddy was an old chief, Castelletta. And her name was, what was her name now? I can't think of it offhand. But they tied her, and eventually one of the scouts married her and had a son. And he's the one that started our cemetery association, Warren Perman.
Oh, wow.
But that was real. But I try to find out whatever happened to her. I don't know. I don't know whether she's buried in our cemetery or she went back to Mexico. But Castelletta was the chief, and I can't remember her name right now. But she was captured, and eventually the guy married her. One of the guys married, had one son.
Well, Mr. Warrior, I want to thank you for taking so much of your time out of your conference schedule. I really appreciate you doing the interview.
But it's time. It's getting late to get all this out, you know. And a lot of the people that were involved in it are dead. And I'm right one of the last links right now. We lost 1, 2, 3 of the older Seminoles. I'm the oldest man. We lost one last year. George Gordon, he was 95 or 96.
Wow.
So I'm 85, and so I'm the oldest one left. And my sister was the oldest lady. She died in September.
Okay.
And she was 87.